Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Marion, and I am the chair of Audubon Chapter of Minneapolis. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in on this beautiful spring night and hope that you're getting out or planning to get out to see some of the migratory birds that are arriving in the Twin Cities. Last Friday, we had a wonderful nighttime woodcock bird walk at Elm Creek Park, and we have a few more outings scheduled this spring, including a visit to the Marshall Terrace Heron Rookery and an outing for people with limited mobility. So I will post a link to our events page in the chat shortly. And in addition to those that are on our calendar, if there is an outing or location you're interested in seeing hosted by our chapter, please get in touch via email or any of our social media channels. As you might have heard when I pressed the record button, this program is being recorded and we'll put it on our chapter's YouTube channel. You can share the video or rewatch parts and send it to people who weren't able to make the program. And then at the end of the program, we will field as many questions as time allows. So as the presentation is going on, if you think of a question, please enter them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter, Dr. Elena West. Dr. Elena West is an avian ecologist and conservation biologist with broad research and teaching interests in animal foraging and movement behavior and quantitative population ecology. She is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota. And much of her ongoing work focuses on how wildlife respond to habitat management and the ecology and conservation of species of management concern. She also works to improve existing methods in wildlife research and to develop novel methods in data collection and analysis with a particular focus on the use of technology. So without further ado, I will hand over and give a warm welcome to Dr. West. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Marion. Can you hear me okay?
Oh yeah, we can hear you, but your screen's not on yet.
Okay, I just shared it. Let's see. Okay. There we go. All right. So everyone hear me okay? All right. So thanks so much for having me, everyone. It's really great to be here. Today, I'm going to share a little bit about the research I've been leading on red-headed woodpeckers over the last several years, including my newer project using bioacoustic monitoring devices to monitor red-headed woodpeckers throughout the state. So I'll walk everybody kind of through some of the basics of bioacoustics technology and how it's being used for biodiversity monitoring and conservation, and then talk a little bit about how I'm using it to study red-headed woodpeckers at a broader spatial scale. So I'd like to acknowledge the organizations that help make this work possible, including the Minnesota Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, that's a part of the University of Minnesota, the Audubon Chapter of Minneapolis, and the Red-headed Woodpecker Recovery Project, the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, and then the University of Minnesota, as well as a number of individual donors. So this work really wouldn't be possible without all of that support from a lot of different organizations. So if you've heard me present on red-headed woodpeckers over the last several years, you might recognize this photo. I've been studying this species since 2017, mostly at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, really to better understand their ecology and behavior, with a focus on sort of providing land management recommendations as part. I'm sorry, you can probably hear my dog playing. My two dogs are playing in the background and I can't do anything about it. So I'm sorry about that. the goal of my work from Cedar Creek is really to better understand the ecology and behavior of red-headed woodpeckers, with this sort of focus on making management recommendations for conservation and habitat restoration efforts. So through this work that's been going on since, at least my involvement has been since 2017, we're really starting to gain a better understanding of the factors that are important for this species. But what we've really kind of still been, what we've been lacking is an understanding of their statewide breeding distribution. Essentially, where are they located outside of a couple of just larger pockets, essentially, of breeding, larger breeding populations in the state. There's certainly statewide data on the likelihood of occurrence of this species. However, it's relatively coarse data, and it's also somewhat outdated. So as an example, I'm showing breeding bird survey data for this species that was collected starting about 10 years ago and then compiled for the state. So this is pretty broad, kind of coarse survey data, and it's somewhat incomplete. There are other more intensive surveys like county biological surveys, but those, of course, don't cover the entire state. They don't really provide the necessary information about the species distribution and reproduction that are really important components of habitat management and restoration efforts. So the current kind of monitoring paradigm simply just isn't sufficient to track changes in this species over time. Our inference is pretty limited to where they've been studied intensively, like places like Cedar Creek. So that's a pretty small spatial extent of what's been going on so far. It just isn't big enough to really make broad scale inferences. So there's really not a lot of baseline information for tracking the population or evaluating, for example, like adaptive management programs that might go on over time. So that kind of lack of information really set the stage, in my mind, at least a couple of years ago, for kind of the need for a rigorous and systematic approach to detecting this species, to try to figure out where it is, and then to monitor it. So I applied for Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund money and was awarded an award. So it's called the Bioacoustics for Broad-Scale Species Monitoring and Conservation Project. And that's what I've been working on since about 2021. And it's essentially basically a broad scale but fine resolution survey for red-headed woodpeckers across potential breeding distribution in Minnesota, using a cutting edge technology, which is autonomous recording units. And I'll talk about that throughout the rest of the presentation. And then also an evaluation of how these devices can best be used to establish a monitoring program for this species, and then possibly other species of management concern. So kind of just to get everybody oriented, what are autonomous recording units? I'm showing 3 different units here in these photos. They really vary in size and kind of housing. They're essentially a circuit board with a battery pack on it, especially the one on the upper left. That's a picture that I took of an audio moth that I'm holding in my hand. That's the smallest unit of the 3 that I'm showing. Fits in the palm of your hand. It takes 3 AA batteries, and it can be left in the woods for days or months. And it records essentially the same things that a person would hear standing in that same spot. Everything from, for example, birds to frogs to wind, rain, planes, but without having to stand in that spot for days or months at a time, which obviously we can't do as human surveyors. So again, unlike most people, these devices, they don't mind sitting for 2 months straight or a couple of weeks in the same spot. recording the sounds in the soundscape, essentially, for several hours a day, regardless of the weather. So once deployed, acoustic recorders effectively capture a snapshot of the species that are vocalizing in the area. Depending on the habitat, between 92% and 99% of species detected in avian surveys, for example, can be detected with these devices. And that came out of some research that was published recently from a group at the University of Pittsburgh. So zooming out a little bit, why collect autonomous monitoring data? Well, so the main reason is that to understand and prevent biodiversity loss, you need to understand where the biodiversity is in the first place. When we're talking about birds, for example, bird populations are increasingly imperiled. We all know that. Worldwide, 14% of bird species are threatened with extinction by 2100. And then in North America in particular, bird populations have decreased by about 25% in the past 50 years. So it's really important from a conservation perspective to understand where biodiversity are located in order that we can devise management programs and restoration efforts and conservation programs to try to protect them in those locations. So currently, the most common method of conducting animal surveys is really by direct observation. So this means a person goes out, they write down what species they see or hear, how many individuals they see or hear, and when and where those species were present. So some of you may have heard of things like point counts, road-based surveys, there are transect surveys, lots of different ways to survey animals, especially birds or frogs. These are species that really vocalize a lot. These surveys really pinpoint critical habitat for not only for birds, but other vocalizing species. And then they suggest, they help us figure out how to protect and manage these areas. Surveys that are then repeated over years or decades can really help identify how birds are affected by and are adapting to changes in land use and climate change patterns, for example. The Breeding Bird Survey in the United States is a really good example of a long-term kind of human-based survey that's been conducted. These surveys are really foundational to our current knowledge. And they don't necessarily give the most detailed information about bird biology, but they really, again, are kind of what we have had to use and what we've been using for many, many years to kind of set the stage for not only research questions, but a lot of conservation programs as well. So ecology is sort of traditionally been quite focused on these types of in-person surveys, but we're really in the midst of a revolution in automated sensing. And so what I wanted to highlight here is just that passive acoustic survey methods are essentially, they're better for tasks that in-person biodiversity surveys aren't as good at. It doesn't mean that we want to take humans out of the survey efforts necessarily. There are some situations where humans are, their ability to detect certain species is as equal to a recording device is equal to a recording device. But when you're talking about scaling up and being able to cover more ground, acoustic monitoring or passive acoustic survey methods are really becoming not only more widely used, but just a sort of a better approach from an efficiency perspective. So you can really get greater coverage because you have the ability to increase your temporal and spatial scales. So if you kind of think about it this way, excuse me, currently a sound recorder can cost as little as $50 to purchase. You add a little bit of expense to equipment costs to that, like a micro SD card or an SD card. And then you have to spend a little bit of money getting out into the field. But once you've made that investment, you can use the recorder really to capture as much data as you want for as long as you want, assuming you have the battery life to do so and sort of the storage capacity to do so. And over the life of the recorder, that could be thousands and thousands of hours of sound. You could spend those hours in any way you want, whether that's surveying in more places or days, or getting data over a number of seasons, for example. So again, it's just a really efficient way to have greater coverage at both a temporal and spatial scale that's really different from human-based surveys. Passive acoustic monitoring or survey methods are also really great for surveying rare or infrequently vocalizing species, because they can really generate these long continuous recordings that vastly increase the amount of time that you can sample listening for those infrequent vocalizations. So if you go out as a human surveyor at dawn, you might not hear your really rare species that you're hoping to hear. But if you leave a device out for, let's say, a couple of weeks, you increase your chances of detecting that species. For example, another example is if you wanted to capture the first song of a newly arriving migrant bird, a human would have to sit in the same spot every day waiting for that bird to sing. And if you wanted to survey more sites, you'd need a different person at each site. So that kind of gives you a sense for how these devices can be used a little bit more efficiently to cover more ground. For the same reason, they can also be used to survey for example, shy species that are hard to get eyes on. Nocturnal species are another example that they're being used for increasingly. Also, species that are located in remote locations that are really hard to access. You could leave a device out on the landscape and then leave it there for a really long time, come back, only have to come back once to pick it up, assuming you have the battery power and storage power to do so. So just a really neat kind of like broad, a couple of examples of how passive acoustic survey methods are being essentially used in ways that allow us to cover more ground, both temporally and spatially. So most current applications of autonomous recorders really require human listeners to identify sounds. It's a process that's still pretty time consuming for large scale studies. And we refer to this human listening and identification process as annotation. So we're sort of going through a lot of the calls that have been recorded, or a lot of the sounds that have been recorded, and we're annotating what they are, where we use human experts to say, yes, this is an American robin, or no, this is not a scarlet tanager, and so forth. So we haven't taken humans out of the process yet entirely. I don't foresee that happening anytime soon, even though we're really able to collect lots and lots more data now with these devices. The processing stages are still really require human sort of guidance, I would say. So machines and robots aren't taking our jobs quite yet. So research using sound was historically really cumbersome and pretty imprecise. But what changed recently, so audio recording technology has existed for a long time. But what changed recently is that companies like Microsoft and Google actually started sharing their artificial intelligence work that allowed for significant improvements in speech recognition. So we're really currently in the midst of what a lot of people refer to as a revolution in terms of autonomous sensing approaches that allow us to combine autonomous recorders with computer programs that can essentially automatically or almost sort of semi-automatically identify the sounds captured on those devices. So essentially what you're doing is using a lot of input information, like this is what a red-headed woodpecker sounds like. You give it tons and tons of clips of what that bird sounds like, using a specific call, for example, and you train your machine learning algorithm to recognize and distinguish between that red-headed woodpecker and a crow, for instance, or a jay. And this technology is, so when I started this project in 2021, we didn't have really automated algorithms to distinguish between multiple different kinds of species. But now the technology, even in just 2 years, has been sort of pushed to the point where we do have algorithms that are much, much better at doing that. And so it's really taking a lot of the work, that sort of work of going through files and files and files and having to annotate them, and making it a little bit more automated. So now these machine learning and artificial intelligence tools are being applied to wildlife monitoring. For example, in Africa, it's being used really widely to monitor conservation and efforts, and then also poaching of elephants. There's a lot of research that is like this one, the red-headed woodpeckers, that's taking place. I'm in this picture showing the Yosemite toad. There's a big project in the Sierra Nevada kind of range where Yosemite toads are declining, to monitor their populations. And then I'm also showing spotted owls on the bottom. There's a huge project on the West Coast, particularly in California, that's using these devices to detect spotted owls as their habitat is being encroached upon by barred owls out there. So super, super interesting. Lots and lots of ways that this technology is being used across the world. Again, though, I want to reiterate that there's automated sound detection, it exists, but it's mostly only semi-automated. We still have to have humans to kind of go through what a machine tells us those sounds are, and then we have to say yes, no, you're wrong, or you're right, and then kind of revise how we go from there to then get really rigorous data out of those machine learning algorithms. So the goal for the Red-headed Woodpecker project is really to collect occupancy information in potential breeding habitat across the state. So this is a schematic that I put together that kind of details the project. Our secondary goal is to test different devices. There are more expensive models out there, there are cheaper models, and we thought, well, if we want to devise a monitoring program for this species, we should figure out how to do it affordably. So then the idea is to go out, collect a ton of data all over the state, then process that audio data with the help of machine learning algorithms, and use what we find to make recommendations based on our evaluation, so that we can apply this to the development, hopefully, of a statewide monitoring program or protocol for red-headed woodpeckers. So how do we do this? As I mentioned earlier, I think AirU's passively record everything that's all acoustically active species. So anything that's vocalizing, and even things like planes, cars, wind, rain. And that's all great, but it does mean that we have to be able to tell our algorithm what sound to look for. And since we're testing 2 different models, which I'm showing here, the Audio Moth on top, which is our less expensive model, and then on the bottom, this is a Swift device that's made by folks from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. It's the more expensive model. We have to tell these, we have to pull that audio data from these devices and then figure out how well they detect those sounds. So since in 2021, we ran a pilot season, and at the Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve, where we have a breeding population of red-headed woodpeckers, makes it super easy to collect a lot of audio data. We ran this pilot study to really help us develop our sampling methods. We collected data on the distance at which red-headed woodpecker call types can be picked up by these devices. So you want to make sure that you know how far away the device needs to be, or the bird needs to be from the device. That gives you a sense for your detection probability. We also used our pilot data to look at the timing and seasonality of calls. So for example, when in the day do they call the most, and during what part of the breeding season are they most active in terms of calling? So do they call only in May, and then do they stop in June? Or did they call equally throughout the entire morning or the entire day throughout the entire breeding season? So we kind of had a hunch about what we would find going into that, but we needed to have data to confirm that. A big part of our pilot season was creating what's called a vocalization library, which we need in order to create that algorithm so that we can pull out our calls of interest. So these help us essentially it helps us train our algorithm to detect the calls that we want it to detect. And creating this call library really required a lot of effort. We had to use hundreds of calls, and that took a lot of work to find those calls, collect those calls, and then clip and kind of organize them. So all of this was used, it's really key information in order to create a sampling design at the statewide scale, so that we were using the resources that we have, the time, the money, and the people helping, to going out in the field to collect, to put out our devices and then go and get them kind of as effectively and efficiently as possible. So those were our goals here. We learned a lot during our pilot season. We learned that our devices can detect red-headed woodpecker calls up to about 150 meters, which is important to know, again, for device placement in the field during our big sampling efforts. So that kind of helps inform how dense you want to place your devices in the field. We also learned more about the seasonality of calls. We learned that this species really stops calling pretty intensively. They call pretty intensively in May for most of the month as they're establishing territories, and pairs are kind of like pairing up and mating and then defending territories. But by end of June, kind of mid-July for sure, they're pretty quiet. Calling also drops off once there are nestlings, which makes sense. It's probably a way to avoid predation by not attracting predators with lots and lots of calling. So that gave us this really nice window of time. So we really knew for 2022 that we had to start our surveys in early May, and then probably be done by like end of June, mid-July at the latest, in order to get enough sort of information that would be helpful. So we also built our vocalization library. We spent about 18 months doing this, going through all of the audio data to compile that library. We have over 500 quia calls. Quia is the term that we use to kind of describe the call that redheads make when they're mostly territorial. It's used by both males and females in territory defense. Males do it a lot when they're setting up a territory and looking for a mate. So it's a pretty common call. And we thought it made a lot of sense to use it for this application because of that. It's also very loud, and that also seemed to be important. We have over 200 chatter calls. We don't know a ton about chatter calls themselves and kind of what they mean, but there's some evidence in the literature to suggest that they're used between members of a pair for communication of some kind, and that it might be indicative of reproduction or a breeding site. So this is something we're working on, and we're kind of exploring a little bit more the use of this call. It could be helpful in helping us differentiate sites that, you know, might be just a single bird, for instance, at a site, or a site that has multiple birds, or perhaps a breeding pair. So that's a little bit, I think the jury's a little bit out on that, but this technology is really, it's being pushed in really unique ways. And this is one way that we might be able to use it in the future, is to sort of say, okay, we have a woodpecker here, but is it breeding or is it by itself? And what's kind of happening in that area? It's pretty exciting. So we also learned through our pilot tests that there is no real difference in the ability of our two different devices to detect red-headed woodpecker calls. So we decided to purchase more of the cheaper device to save money, get more bang for our buck for our field season in 2022. So that was pretty exciting. There are definitely pros and cons to both devices. But for this project, the Audio Moth worked just great. And it's nice that they're small. I think you can hide them really well and kind of camouflage them in the field, which is also nice. There are some disadvantages when they don't have like a protective cover that they come with. Some people have designed them and you can purchase those. We ended up sort of making our own little cages and then putting them in plastic bags to prevent moisture, whereas the Swift devices kind of come in this sealed case so that prevents moisture from getting in. So pluses and minuses, but we decided to go with the cheaper model, and it's been working out pretty well. But one of the big caveats with our 2022 field season was that we were impacted by supply chain issues. So like a lot of people, there was a lot of computer chip shortages. And so we had a lot of these devices on order, but they didn't arrive in time. They actually didn't, we ordered them in early 2022 and they didn't arrive until August. This company is it's called Lab Maker, and they're based in Berlin. And I think they're pretty small as a company, and this technology is growing so swiftly, and there were supply chain issues that they just ran out of devices, and so they couldn't fulfill a lot of orders last year. So we had to wait, and we had to scale back our plans for 2022, which was unfortunate, but we made it work. Excuse me. I am getting over a cold, so I apologize. My voice is giving out. I taught today too, so I'm kind of struggling to keep it together.
You're doing great, Elena, and let me know if you want to mute for a second.
Thanks, Marion.
I can sing a little or something.
I think I can make it. I just needed to take a drink of water.
Oh, yeah, take your time.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, we had to scale back our plans in 2022. And we had devices from our pilot season. So we were able to use those and devise a sampling scheme that allowed us to still collect data, with just at a different spatial scale. So we had a lot less coverage across the state. Okay. So for our statewide surveys, we randomly located survey areas within a grid cell network that we distributed across the state. We placed a 20-kilometer grid across the state. And then within those grid cells, we quantified land cover types based on their potential in terms of red-headed woodpecker breeding habitat. We actually, you might be wondering why we chose a 20 by 20 kilometer grid. And we actually had to choose that scale because smaller size grid cells didn't contain enough potential habitat based on our assessment of land cover in the state. So this species, as you might know, really prefers kind of this open understory with kind of like a not much canopy cover. They certainly will breed in areas where there's like along forest edges, but they really like that kind of savanna or park-like landscape. And that's not actually that easy to find right now in the state because a lot of it has been lost to agricultural conversion and housing development. So it was a little bit challenging also just based on what we have from a land cover data perspective to find. So we were a little bit limited there, but that 20-kilometer scale really helped us be able to devise a sampling scheme that we thought would work. We also decided to eliminate grid cells in the top third of the state, given that there's so little breeding habitat in the northern part of the state. It's made up mostly of prairie in the western portion and conifer forest in the eastern portion. And that's just generally not great habitat for red-headed woodpeckers. Ultimately, we chose 17 grid cells to sample in. It's a little messy here on this map, but it kind of shows you the spatial extent of our sampling locations throughout the state. We had 216 individual locations where we placed devices. This is one of those grid cells showing the transects that we sampled from. We had 4 ARU transects per grid cell, and then each transect was a kilometer long and had 3 ARUs separated by 250 meters to maintain independence between the sampling locations. And then in each grid cell, we did 4 point count transects as well. So we did a comparison between our ARU devices, sampling, and then we had human observers do point count surveys along 4 separate transects. So we were interested in learning if that would give us extra data, if our point counts would detect red-headed woodpeckers, just as kind of like a point of comparison between ARUs as sampling devices and humans. So our pilot test showed that red-headed woodpeckers were most active in terms of calling between 7 a.m. and 11 a.m. So that was our window with which the devices were set to record. And then we also learned through our pilot work that if a red-headed woodpecker is there, you will detect it with a recording device within a pretty short period of time. And at Cedar Creek, during our pilot surveys, that was about 24 hours. So just having essentially like one morning or 2 mornings max gave us the information at Cedar Creek to know that they were there. So we decided to be a little bit conservative this first year, and we put devices out for 3 days to maximize our detection probability. So this is an audio moth in the field. This is what our setup looks like. So we decided to use suet cages to house them on the outside, which is protection from rodents. There's a lot of, at least at Cedar Creek, there's a lot of different kinds of rodents that really love to chew on things. So, and then each ARU was placed into a heat sealed bag so that we could prevent moisture from getting in if there was a rain event or just other like humidity And then we strung a python lock through the cages and then tied them to a tree, all at about the same height, about 4 feet off the ground, all facing the same, generally the same direction. And the microphones were all in the lower right corner. So that's what it looks like. This is my team in 2022. I had 5 people going all over the state, putting out these devices and then going back to collect them and then help us process the data. This is, I'm showing a spectrogram, and it's really essentially a visual representation of the spectrum of frequencies of a signal as it varies with time. So this is a spectrogram, and we've placed boxes over the QIA calls. They're a little bit hard to see, but you can see that actually there's a pretty low frequency range with these calls. And this has made it pretty challenging to detect them, but we've been working at it for quite a while. So I think we've got our technique down, but I think some of that faint nature of these calls is possibly because the calls that we were picking up are actually a bit further away. So the device is still able to detect them. But if the bird is further away, then it's just going to be a little bit harder to see them on the spectrogram. And then it also makes it harder for a machine learning algorithm or a classifier to actually classify them correctly. So you kind of run into some sound quality issues sometimes. And we spent the last year or so developing a detector using a software program called Kaleidoscope. It's kind of like a out of the box type of program that allows you to input a ton of different clipped calls of the sound of interest that you're looking for. And then it clusters similar calls together. And then you're able to go through those and say, yes, this is correct. I identify this correctly, or you can kind of see how it does, and then fiddle with the settings in order to improve your detection rate. And then we're also testing that detector against another machine learning algorithm that's a little bit more advanced in the sense that it's more automated. So that makes it easier on the kind of the going in side. On the post-processing side, it's a lot more work, but we're trying to figure out the best way to process all of these hundreds and hundreds of hours of data that we've collected and will collect this coming field season as well. It's been a really time-intensive process we have been able to get it to a point where we could run it against all of the data that we collected in 2022, which was pretty exciting. And what we found was that it only three, not zero, 3 of the 216 locations we sampled in, we had positive red-headed woodpecker detections. And those were at Sherburne National Wildlife Refuge, a location that's kind of near St. Croix State Park. It wasn't in the park, but it was near there. And then Lebanon Hills, which is the star. I'm showing these with orange stars here. And I think I got my my locations correct. Lebanon Hills is a regional park that's part of Dakota County. It's south of the Twin Cities in Egan. And interestingly, Lebanon Hills and the Dakota County Park System, they've actually really been managing for red-headed woodpeckers and other oak savanna species because they're really interested in seeing if they can get some birds to come breed there in their park. So this was, I wouldn't say necessarily a surprise, but it was really exciting to see that there was actually some birds there. And we think that there were more than one. So our plan is to probably go back to these locations in 2023 and record just again as kind of like a separate part of the study to see if there are birds that have returned to these locations. So It definitely doesn't seem like a lot. I was hoping for 3 at least. I was actually hoping for just anything more than 0. I was really being kept up at night, worried that we weren't going to find anything with these devices. It is a little bit like trying to find a needle in a haystack. This species, by all accounts, kind of anecdotal accounts, it's pretty rare on the landscape. There's maybe 1 or 2 birds here and there that are kind of either coming through or breeding somewhere, but that's hard to find. Even with an acoustic monitoring device, it's difficult to find. And so that means that it really behooves us to increase our sampling density of where we sample, so that we can really try to maximize this study. So another thing I wanted to mention, one of the detection challenges that we've had with our audio, with our sort of algorithm to detect red-headed woodpeckers, is confusion between red-headed woodpecker kuia calls and a couple of other species, but namely one other species. And so I'm going to play these 2 calls, and you might think to yourself, just think to yourself, I guess, what you think this is. Okay, so you got your idea for call number 1. Here's call number 2. Okay, so it might be, I feel like we probably have a lot of birders on this call, or on this talk. So you might have a really good idea. And if this is what you guessed, that the first call was a red-bellied woodpecker and the second call was a red-headed woodpecker, you would be correct. Our machine learning algorithms have a pretty tough time differentiating between these 2 species. I think those calls were fairly distinct, but there are a lot of calls that are very, very similar. And I consider myself an expert at this point. And I had even a hard time with some cases knowing whether what I was hearing was a red-bellied woodpecker or a red-headed woodpecker. And so that's kind of one of our main challenges. One of the algorithms also had a hard time differentiating kuia calls from red-headed woodpeckers with blue jays and crows, which was pretty interesting. It also, and this was early days, it sort of was confusing things together and lumping everything together. It also had a hard time, it often threw nuthatches, white-breasted nuthatches in. So we kind of ran into these interesting problems with differentiating different calls that might actually sound kind of similar or have a similar kind of range or pattern. So that's been kind of a really big learning curve for us. But I think we have a pretty good algorithm at this point, and I'm feeling pretty good going into the 2023 season in terms of our ability to know, or to be perhaps more than 80% or 90% certain that what we have is a red-headed woodpecker, not something else. But we certainly, in studies like this, you always will report your, your false positive rate and your false negative rate if you can. It's really hard to get those numbers sometimes, but especially when you have like terabytes of data, you can't go through it all. But you can subsample your data, and you can, kind of estimate what your false detection rate might be and what your false positive rate might be. So for the 2023 field season, our goal is to increase the spatial scale of sampling. So we have lots of devices, we're ready to go. And then also we'll increase the sampling density of our devices, of our device locations. We are probably going to eliminate point counts. So we didn't detect any red-headed woodpeckers using or on our point count surveys last summer. And it's pretty time intensive, especially at the scale at which we're trying to do this. So I think we're gonna save our time and energy doing that, and then try to use that to get more devices out. And then we're going to decrease the sampling days from 3 to 2, which will also allow us to cover a lot more ground. So that's what we've got planned for we're getting started in just a couple of weeks. So you'll have to stay tuned. I'll be putting out all of this information in presentations and papers, and we'll definitely be working really hard over the next couple of years to get our results out to the public. So with that, I'm going to take a drink of water, and thank you very much for your attention and kind of suffering through my coughing fit. If you're interested in supporting this work, any amount of support helps. This is a really big project. I'm hoping to expand it further eventually. I'm currently applying for some other funding, but anything that you can, do to help this work is very much appreciated. And I have a university-based link that I'm showing here that would help you donate pretty quickly online. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'll take questions.
Great, thanks, Elena. And I see a couple people have their hands raised in the chat. There's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Yep. You might have to maximize your screen to see it. Otherwise, it will be under the ... more icon. So feel free to enter any questions you have. And I can start off with a question, Elena, if you're ready.
Always, yeah.
I was wondering, so for the slide where you were talking about your site inclusion or your site selection criteria, did you say that there was like a 20, what was the minimum square footage of your sites?
The grids, the sampling
grids. Yeah.
20 by 20 kilometers.
Okay. So does that eliminate noise pollution? And I guess as an aside, when we were doing the woodcock outing in Elm Creek Park, we were getting so much airplane noise, even though it was in a park that is kind of drowning out some of the woodcock calls. And I was wondering if the devices ever pick up noise pollution and if that is actually a factor given how much data it's collecting.
Yeah, it's a great question. So planes background noise can be really problematic in detection and sound analyses. So it can really confuse things. It's actually why I think people who study nocturnal species are at quite an advantage, because there's not as much calling at night. So people who study owls or other like nocturnal species, they kind of get rid of a lot of that background noise just by virtue of the time of day that they're studying. There's also a lot of overlap during the day between, like, multiple birds are going to be calling. And so that can be really challenging. Those are some of the areas of this technology that I think people are going to be working on for a while to try to kind of like help sort out how you can differentiate and pull out the sounds of interest in an automated way, because that's really where the bottleneck is right now with this technology, is that we do have automated ways to detect and differentiate species, but it still requires a person or many people actually to kind of like differentiate, what's right and like what's what from what. Does that make sense, Marian?
Yes. Yeah. And I actually have another question about the machine learning and whether, I don't know if the vocabulary, like the jargon is like species tagging, but are you like, is the machine learning tool identifying all species within a given soundscape to help eliminate or identify like what the whole soundscape is, or are you only interested in, is it a red-headed woodpecker, or is it not a red-headed woodpecker?
So for the purposes of this project, we're just interested in red-headed woodpeckers, but one of the things, and I should have mentioned this, but didn't, that, we have now, hundreds and hundreds of hours of audio from all over, and we will have more. And so you could go back and pick out another species to study if you wanted. The really neat thing about audio recordings like this is that they serve somewhat like a time capsule or like a museum specimen, in that they're preserved, and they're, hopefully you can make them available to the commons, or use them yourself if you have the capacity. And they could potentially serve as a way, like a baseline information for future research or efforts to understand how changes might be impacting a given species or a group of species.
Cool. And then I'll ask another question, because I don't see anyone else entering their questions. And I know you probably want to stop talking, but it's so interesting. Is there anything like particularly fun or exciting that you happened across just as like an audio bite or like a data point? And then were there any like particularly like significant data points that you were able to pick up that like stand out to you, that like the first part is like maybe just like something that was like fun and interesting versus maybe not as important, and then the second part is like, are there any like individual data points that stand out to you?
Well, I guess I could answer both. The one of the automated algorithms that we've used actually has pulled out a couple of rare species that I wouldn't necessarily think was correct in the locations where they were detected. And I'm not remembering what those species were right now, but I think one of them was like a more Western passerine. And so, you can go back and listen, but you'd have to have a lot more data in order to know if it was correct or not. And so that's just kind of interesting, is that some of I guess it's a opportunity and a challenge with the technology to try to, maybe more rare species will be detected, but you also have to have the ability to test that rigorously and to know that what you're hearing is actually what you're hearing. And that's really the challenge. So some of it is just kind of surprising sometimes. So we've been really focused on red-headed woodpeckers and kind of honing that right now. And so I would love to go back and try to pull out some other species to see what we find, like across our sampling range, to see if maybe there's another species that also needs this kind of open savanna habitat that we might, like bluebirds, for instance. Uh-oh. I don't know if I answered your question, Marian.
Oh yeah, you did. And then if you want to take a drink, I can read Jim Stengel's question. He asks if ARUs will be placed in partial grid cells this year. For example, where St. Croix and the Mississippi rivers truncate cells. Very technical.
Yeah, that's a good question, Jim. I think we may not sample in those grid cells just by virtue of them not being complete, but I think we could potentially do like half, if they're about half the size, maybe. We're trying to use a random sample point generator to try to do this randomly, so that also determines kind of as like a first pass where we sample And then from there, accessibility is another factor. So it is not entirely random in that sense, because some places you just are just like really hard to get to. So, road accessibility or trail accessibility is a factor.
Jim
Yeah.
asked another question. Red-headed woodpeckers breed in the driftless areas of Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. What about sampling near those state lines?
Yeah, and those will probably be locations that will be able to sample in 2023 because we have enough devices. Where we sampled last year, we were just really limited by these were locations that were picked out randomly, but also we were just limited by device numbers.
So I have another question. Do you think you'll be expanding to privately held land, as you are able to locate more potential habitats that meet your criteria?
Yeah, we have sampled on some private lands where we can, or along the edges of private land. It has definitely been a challenge, and I think sampling on private lands would be like more extensively would be a really important thing to do in the future because so much of Minnesota is owned by private landowners and is not public. So I think that in that sense, that would be certainly a goal of mine to expand to private lands more broadly, I think.
So as a follow-up, and then I promise I'll let you go get a cough drop.
Okay, it's okay.
Have you like imagined this idea of bioacoustic sampling and then like the monitoring as like a potential like point of engagement with these private landowners, or like potential like citizen scientists, or like as maybe a tool to like enable people to hear what their landscape sounds like at night on recording? And like, I don't know if you've just sort of like imagined or reflected on like how the tools and methods of acoustic ecology might like dovetail or like interact with like engaging private landowners as like a stakeholder or like a participant.
Yes, I have. And that was actually a big part of a proposal that I just submitted to try to expand this work onto private lands, but as kind of more of a citizen science-based project, to not only be able to sample over multiple land ownership types, but also to kind of engage people in understanding what the soundscapes on their own property. So we'll see. I don't know if I've been awarded that fund, that proposed that grant, but I will keep you posted.
Cool. Well, that sounds like a very interesting direction, or at least I'm very interested in that. Yeah.
For sure.
If I were a landowner who had a big oak savanna and someone wanted me to like, listen to recordings of what it sounded like, I would be all in. So yeah, I hope it works out.
Yeah, well, and the one of the really neat things, and a lot of people who are here tonight might know about BirdNet, which was developed by people at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it is one of these automated sound detectors. I think a BirdNet can detect like 3,000 different bird calls, I believe, right now. And they're working on it to try to expand to other species. I think there are some amphibians that it can detect as well right now. And so it's the foundation of the Merlin app, which a lot of people are using now on their phones. And so that's, I think, kind of like the next frontier for, I mean, their goal is that people are able to do it already with their phone, with their smartphone. And so, but obviously you don't want to leave your phone in the woods for like 3 weeks. So, yeah. So anyway, BirdNet is a really cool tool that I think people are getting excited about, but it is kind of like expanding this idea of kind of people collecting data and then contributing it to like the open kind of open science community, community groups as well. So how accurate are the apps? So I mean, I think that's a really important question. BirdNet is, I think, it works really well for certain species and then not great for other species. And I think that's an area that I know Cornell is working really hard on. And, as more sound data kind of gets contributed to these types of projects, I think they'll only get better and better. But certainly, I think you sometimes hear things or you get detections of things on BirdNet that are not accurate. So you definitely have to be careful, and you have to, for like a scientific study, you'd have to pull out some data and then really use like an expert to try to validate what you're hearing. So that's a really important step. And that's what I was, talking about earlier, is it's part of the process that just takes a really, really long time. So an important question though, as we move forward with this technology. But, I will say that like the chat GPT stuff and some of that is a little bit like, there's a lot of unknowns there. It's kind of scary in some ways, but I think there are really great elements to this technology. So we just have to be really mindful about how we use it and how it's applied. So, but here, I think in this case, I think that there are some really great applications for conservation and science.
Well, thank you, Elena, Dr. West, for such an interesting and exciting research area and wonderful presentation. And thank you, everyone who attended. We hope to see you at our future events. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us by email. And once again, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Marian. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.